And here we are. So it's kind of the completion of 3 years of working together
Wow.
in different ways around, I guess the journey for me started with thinking about artists' well-being. We knew coming out of the pandemic there was a real gap for freelancers in particular, um, to feel that they were connected. Actually, it was more about connection, to being able to access resource through connection. And for freelancers, often I'll include myself, we're working on our own over here, running our projects, setting things up, and maybe going out to deliver with organizations, but that could be different every day of the week. And in the pandemic, everybody became much more isolated because we weren't going out so much to connect. We were working in a very virtual way. And one of the things that felt was really lost in that is our capacity for connection, for chats, and probably realizing how much we unpack in those informal conversations with each other, with the people we're delivering for. Um,
Yeah.
that was lost. And I think for me, what I became very aware of then is how sort of precarious, I suppose, is a word I'm using a lot with the freelance sector, but how precarious those well-being spaces became when we couldn't connect. And actually, there was nothing really structured or structural in place to support um, most freelancers' well-being. Some organizations were starting to do some work, but it wasn't really consistent across Wales. So we developed this project, How You Doing, which was about supporting artist well-being. And for the first 2 years, we were trying different kinds of programs. And then that developed into another 2 years of a program. First year was funded by the Arts Council, and then the second iteration was funded by the Bearing Foundation with a slightly different focus. So we're focused much more on artists' mental well-being, or artists who are working in mental well-being settings with the Bearing Foundation work. That's kind of the context of where I've been for the last 3 years. And then I've been in dialogue with you and some other artists and freelancers to explore what is needed, what is wanted by the sector, and then what can we offer? And then how is that impacting? And then how might we change our offer based on what people want, really? Um,
Yeah.
so that's kind of an overview for anybody who might be listening who isn't aware of what we've been doing.
Mm,
But I think where I'd like to start with you, Alison, is really a personal question of what inspires you to offer reflective practice, both for artists directly and also then in the way that you've developed a training course for artists and others to learn how to deliver reflective practice. What's your inspiration?
thanks, Tracy. Well, I feel like I'm already feeling, just listening to you as you started talking then, I'm kind of remembering, oh yeah, this is why I'm passionate about this work, because we're reflecting right now on what we've shared the last few years. And I think for me, as I was listening to you there, when you talked about the pandemic and what that kind of highlighted in terms of lack of support and that isolation lots of arts practitioners experience. And, I think for me, I had kind of just begun just before the pandemic to to do a little bit of study, a bit of research around arts practitioners' emotional well-being. So I was, I've kind of always been interested in this. And when I think back to, I started out working in prisons doing theatre like 25 years ago. And I was um, thinking recently that at that stage, we used to work in this really tight-knit company. We'd be working with people who, are I would argue, among the most traumatized people in our society, in our world, with those social, economic barriers that all kinds of life difficulties. And in our theatre work, we would be hearing stories that were just heartbreaking. Often we would also be hearing stories of incredible strength and courage and overcoming things, but a lot of them were really, really painful. And we would come out of the prison and get in the van and go and drive somewhere else. And what we would do is we would laugh. That was a huge bit. We would kind of do a bit of informal debriefing, but then we would just carry on. And at that stage, when I look back, that idea of reflecting deeply on the impact of what we were hearing and what we were holding just wasn't there, really. It certainly wasn't there for me and for my peers. And then fast forward to probably around 2017, 2018. And I had at this point, alongside my theatre work, my arts practice, had also trained as a counsellor and then a supervisor. So I kind of had these two strands of my professional life. And in the therapeutic side, reflection and supervision was actually deeply embedded in the work. It was mandatory. If you work as a supervisor or a therapist, supervision, is a requirement, and that space for reflection. So I was really noticing how in my own arts work and in that of friends and peers, there was this gap. And I think it was at that time as well that the arts and health world was really, really, sort of galvanizing, taking off. And suddenly there was this, I felt this recognition. I was having conversations with others where people were saying, this is really, really tough. And I'm starting to question whether I can sustain this, and I thought I'd be an artist my whole life. And actually, I don't know now because this is really hurting me. And a friend of mine who worked in prisons for 30 years said to me at one point, I may need to step back because the work hurts. And this for me was a bit of a light bulb moment of going, okay, um, I know that place myself, I'm hearing it in others, and it just suddenly felt really, really obvious to me that we need to create spaces where arts practitioners who are now as well, as our field has evolved of socially engaged arts, arts and health practice, we are now working in those incredibly complex, sensitive areas of refugees, mental health, the prison system, dementia care, and actually um, the need to have spaces where arts practitioners themselves can be held. And I think one of the things that really kind of drives me is to offer a space and to experience it for myself too with peers where we can share the weight of the work. And I think that for me is kind of what really drives my interest in this area. And that it then kind of enables us to not only grow professionally, but personally too. So that's certainly been my journey. The more I engaged in reflecting deeply, going, okay, what is happening in my work? What does this mean to me? What does this tell me about my values, perhaps, and the world? Um, the more I guess changes me as a person, and that's a gift I think that can come from it too. That
Mm.
was a really long-winded answer to your question.
It really, what I hear, Al, is like it's through your career this is developed over 25 years of practicing in one way and then finding some other practices and going, oh, this is missing and how would it change? So it's kind of feels like it's been developmental for you of finding it through your career. Not re I think sometimes, again, when we're an individual practitioner, it's easy to think that um because this is the way I do it, this is the way everyone does it, and we're all just getting on with it in our own lives, in our own ways. And it sounds like it's only when you start to really see how other people are doing it and realizing where there are commonalities that you think, oh, actually, this isn't just me, and maybe we don't have to do it this way. Maybe there could be another way of doing it that is more supportive, that is easier. something like that. And it kind of leads me to the next question, which, and I'm going to put this in as a little bit of a provocation. I don't necessarily think it, but I think I hear it sometimes from funders in particular, sort of in
Mm.
the backgrounds is what's not being said, which is um, why, as an art sector, should we be providing this for artists? Surely, as professionals, they can just access their own supervision needs. Like, can they just look after their own well-being? Why is it a provision that comes from the art sector itself? Um, and sort of this side of that is this just an individual's responsibility to look after their mental well-being, emotional well-being, or is there a collective responsibility here around well-being? And how do you sort of feel within those binaries really around individual responsibility, collective responsibility?
Yeah. Yeah, great question. Um, yeah, so I guess my response to that really is that I think both. I think as arts practitioners working in challenging sometimes areas, I think we do have an individual responsibility to look after ourselves, to sustain ourselves and to reflect. But I think the collective responsibility is perhaps even greater. I think that sense of solidarity in a field like arts and health and applied arts is so vital. We are often people are working freelance, working in, as you mentioned earlier, in that precariousness, lack of financial security, a lack of sometimes clear sort of remits and structures. So I think, from my experience of holding reflective practice groups, that experience of people being able to listen to one another's work life and challenges and joys, and have their own experiences witnessed is for me that's where the transformative potential lies in reflective practice. That sense of, okay, shared discovery. I'm not alone here. I'm not the only one who at times drives home from a workshop in a community setting going, wow, did I do the right thing? Was that okay? Was that ethical? Was that safe? So having a space, ideally a regular reflective space where together that can be unpicked and held, not only strengthens and enriches the arts practice, so then there's a ripple benefit to everyone involved, but I think really, in my experience, can shape and deepen the practitioner's skills, abilities, and wisdom. For me, I think that's a term perhaps we don't use enough. That when we have shared reflection, we can kind of distill the wisdom from what's being learned and what's being tried out.
Yeah, I'm getting a real sense of sort of separating out maybe um so if I'm a practitioner working with a community group or in a health setting, and sometimes it's about my skills as a facilitator, as an artist, in how I'm meeting that group. And they're the things that I might bring to a reflective practice session. But sometimes I'm in that experience and some emotional part of my own history is triggered. So I might call it my own trauma or whatever. So something in me that's very personal to me is triggered in the work. And that's the place where I feel like that's where I need my own therapist, coach, supervision, whatever. That there are also things that are very personal that I need to take responsibility for to be able to manage that, and to know that if I'm working in certain settings, that that's likely to be triggered. Like, it's part of the course. So then I think, well, how do I take responsibility for that? Well, then I need to make sure that within my fees for this work, that I am including a kind of budget line for my own work, which I have seen it come up. Daniel Reagan, who runs a lot of arts and health projects in London, has talked about this. Um, I forget the exact term. If I can find it, I'll add it in a link. But about the, I suppose it's almost like the secondary trauma is sometimes what it's called, the impact on me of doing this work with this user group. But I build that in as an actual cost because I'm going to need to have supervision or therapy as part of it.
Absolutely. I totally, totally support that. And, when I think back when working at Relive with Karen, and the two of us, when we started doing lots of work with military veterans and families, we it was we realized that we would get to the end of a session and we were working with a team of like filmmaker, musician, dance practitioners, so this amazing, really highly skilled team. But the nature of the material we were working with and the complexity of participants' needs meant that we would regularly get to the end of a session and we would be, on our knees, we'd be exhausted. And during that time, I went to Northern Ireland and I met with Taya, who runs Theatre of Witness. And it was a really interesting moment for me because here was someone in doing very similar work to us at Relive. Taya was doing this in Northern Ireland. And we had this connection. We talked about our work. And I remember so clearly, she said to me, at the end of a session, I'm so exhausted, I often have to just lie on the floor. And I said, wow, we're doing exactly the same thing in Cardiff. We're so exhausted, we're lying on the floor. And it was again another light bulb moment about, hang on now, that is not sustainable. Across a whole career, as a professional, to be regularly so depleted by the work, even though at the same time, and I think this is a challenge for lots of artists because we love the work we do. And often, and Nicola Naismith in her great report, Artists Practicing Well, talks about this, that lack of separation often for artists between who I am as a person and who I am in my work means that often, that perhaps the sort of boundary that we might have, say I have in my work as a therapist, for example, just isn't there often in that art space. So I think we can argue for reflective practice, you know, regularly, and as you said, to be built into budgets is, I would say, even greater than in some professions like counseling and psychotherapy, where at least there's a clear contract with a client, that we have 1 hour once a week. We probably don't have any communication in between that. That clarity I think is really protective. Whereas if I compare some of the arts projects I've done over the years, often there's that kind of grey line of, wow, well, who are we to each other, are we colleagues, are we friends, are we co-creators, like where's the boundary? And in the reflective practice sessions that I run, that's often something that emerges, people saying, okay, I feel this real close connection to somebody I'm working with. We're approaching the end of the project. I'm not sure how to manage this. And then in a group space, that can be explored. And I think maybe that might be one thing to share, that reflective practice, really isn't about fixing things or arriving at a solution or having an agenda. It is supportive, an open space to reflect on our work, and to think about that intersection between our personal and professional life. And for when I started doing this work, I think the arguments I would put forward for why it should be funded would be, as a burnout prevention, as a way of looking after people so they don't, burn out, crash, have to take time out or leave the field. But increasingly, the more I do it, I move away from that preventative mindset into actually, this is a space to grow and to access the joy and the wonder of our work. And that's something that I've really, really noticed over the few years of running this work with you, is that arts practitioners, sort of as the sessions go on and as it becomes more like a kind of muscle, this reflection, something they do, really sharing. I'm noticing I'm enjoying my work more. I feel more inspired. I have more to give. Um, so I think only as I'm saying it, I'm really sort of making sense of it. That has been a shift for me as well over these last few years.
Yeah, that's it's really interesting. And I also hear a little bit of differentiation between a kind of a therapy setting and a reflective practice then as well, where we're not focusing on the problem, we're not necessarily focusing on the history and the emotional context of that. It's really the wider field of my relationship to this work that I'm doing, who I am in this work, how this work is impacting me in a broader way. And two thoughts I had while I was hearing you speak there. One about something about being in a group setting that allows more permission, that permission often is one of those things that unless we know something's okay, we might restrict how we're practicing or what we're offering or what we're even asking for in terms of fees and can I be paid for
Yes.
this meeting and can I be paid to take part in the evaluation and is it okay to say negative things to this company because I didn't feel very valued because I want to get work from them in the future. So something
Yeah.
about permission that we only learn through the collective. That oh, that artist asked for that and that was okay, so maybe I could. So
Yes.
that's one thing, permission. And the
Mm.
second is that how I hear you describing reflective practice goes against a kind of product oriented way of working, that we're not doing reflective practice to solve this problem and these are the
Yes.
outcomes and you will learn this and you will be more effective in a certain way, just by opening space with no agenda.
Yes.
We're not heading anywhere. That is so unusual in our work culture that it kind of takes a little bit of brain sort of turning around, scrambling to go, but that's why, what?
Mm.
We're
Yeah,
just
yeah. It's radical.
for an hour and and you're getting paid to do that and
Yeah.
people are paying to take part in that. It's just really against the product oriented work culture that most of us still exist in that paradigm.
Absolutely. And my sort of utopian dream is that we all, regardless of what sector we work in or live in, we would all have this space. You know, just sort of think, globally, if all of our world leaders had a compassionate, reflective space every couple of weeks to go, how am I doing? What kind of decisions am I making? Where am I at? Am I living and working in line with my values? I think we'd live in a different world. I know we would.
Yeah.
So I totally agree with you. It is a challenge to that sort of let's keep moving, let's keep producing, doing. And, artists have always been the ones to question and challenge things and lead the way. So maybe it's totally right that as a field, I think, should be confident in this and in the value of this space and the need for this space as a place to, dream, think, reflect, be with difficult questions, as you said, without that requirement of, okay, what's the outcome? How do we prove its worth?
Mm. We've had so much feedback over the 3 years and really delighted that we've had Jane Willis, who is maybe the leading or one of the leading
Yeah.
evaluators across the UK really working in this field. And I think Jane also brings her own passion because she evaluates so many projects in the field. She can see bigger trends than just our individual sort of context. So one of the things that she said that, this work is doing is that our how you doing approach. So that is the name of the project. How are you doing? Just that individual check-in space. So it's successful not only in supporting participants' individual well-being, but also in equipping those who took part to begin to address inequitable working practices, thereby helping to create a fairer, safer, and more sustainable sector for all. And one of the artists
Mm.
gave a direct quote really to illustrate that and said, I have an increased awareness of the necessity for ensuring that supportive frameworks are in place for the artist, as well as for participants in arts and health and well-being work. I feel enabled to voice this need to organizations and people I am working with and for. So something that not only becoming aware of it, but also being able to feel confident enough to voice it, to ask
Yeah.
for it, and then it can
Advocate.
change,
Yeah,
because then organizations either say yes or no, and then we begin to get this sort of um, yeah, the artists are leading the change because they're asking for
yeah.
what they need. It's not just what they want, it's basic kind of needs that they have for the work to feel safe.
Absolutely. I think that's such a useful quote there. And I think that sense of validation that can come from group reflective practice is linked there too. Often I've kind of heard people say, well, I'm not, what I'm doing is maybe it's not really that much, or it's not. And then having, seeing a group of your peers, sort of reflect back to you, what you're doing is extraordinary, important, needed, just that. Whereas we know when we're in our own silo and we're going, trying to create projects, trying to make enough money to get by, we can lose that perspective sometimes.
Yeah, totally. I think, for me, it goes back to just how our brains work as humans. We only know what anything is when we have a contrast. We only know hot when we know cold. So we only know really busy when we see not so busy. Like
Yeah.
it's always relative. So if we practice as an individual and we never really get to hear about other people's practice in detail, then how do we know how much we're doing or how little we're doing, how well we're
Yes.
looking after ourselves or how not so well we're looking after ourselves, or all of those things that it becomes really relational.
Yes. Absolutely.
I have a question for you, which is in the context of all of this, how do you support your own work and well-being, with reflective practice or other kinds of practices?
Yeah. Well, a really key element for me is I have um, one colleague, one peer. We don't directly work together, but we meet once every month online for a reflective practice session, and there's no money involved. Neither of us are paying each other. It's just we meet. It's reciprocal, and we just open the space with the how are you doing question, and then we just see what we need. So some months we meet and I might, for example, say actually things are feeling pretty steady and pretty okay for me. I don't have anything pressing. And my peer might say I could really do with sharing a few things that are feeling challenging. But then sometimes we might just split the session in half and say, let's just bring where we're at. And that's for me, that's kind of one of the foundations of me knowing, okay, that space is there for me. Um, I also, I have regular supervision once a month. So with my supervisor, which is a different kind of reflective support, but that's really key to me. Um, and also for me, an individual practice which I engage with every day is reflective journaling, which I know Jane Willis, who you mentioned earlier, Jane does some fantastic work and training around this area. But that's so for me, I guess there's those strands, it's peer reflective practice, my own individual reflection and supervision, and then also running reflective and holding reflective practice groups and training arts practitioners in reflective practice is also a key part of my well-being, because every time I run a session or I run a training group, I gain, I think, as much as anybody else does there from that, constant learning, deepening, opening up that happens through witnessing other people reflect.
We've talked a lot about the benefits for individual artists and practitioners, maybe in reflective practice. Maybe let's finish with just a little bit of a reflection on what it's been like to develop a brand new course to
Yeah.
train so facilitators who already can facilitate, and now they're developing a kind of skill set in running reflective practice, both with new groups and within their organizations. How has that journey been for you developing this new course?
Yeah. Really, really wonderful. And I'm so, I'm really grateful to you, Tracy, for this sort of developing this idea, which I think really came from, didn't it? That conversation about how do we make this sustainable? Okay, if we want this, if our dream is for a reflective practice to be embedded in our sector, we need more people running these sessions and holding spaces. So yeah, that's this been a really interesting process for me to design this course to kind of break down, okay, what are the skills, techniques, qualities that are required to hold a reflective practice group. And lots of them, there's a lot of crossover with, we've had on the training so far some highly experienced arts facilitators who are really used to, for example, holding a creative workshop, managing group dynamics. And I think one of the things that's been perhaps challenging for some trainees is that idea of, oh gosh, how do I do less? Reflective practice really is much more about being in that space rather than doing lots of things. So yeah, I've designed this. It's a 2-day experiential training online, where, as you said, it's aimed at arts practitioners who are already experienced facilitators. So it's not an introduction to facilitation, it's looking at what that process of adapting existing facilitation skills into reflective practice skills. And so there's lots of chance to practice, receive feedback, and we look at a little bit of theory, around reflective practice and where it comes from, and what the sort of values and kind of guideposts are underneath it. And that's followed then by a month afterwards, another online session where people come back together again and reflect on how it's been going. What have they noticed when they've started to try this out? So we've trained up together 2 cohorts of practitioners there in Wales. And now this November, I'm going to be running a new, offering it to a new cohort. So reflective practice training for arts practitioners. And yeah, we'll be sharing information about that soon. So if people are interested, there's probably going to be 12 places. So yeah, I really look forward to doing that in the autumn.
Yeah, as I'm listening to you and thinking about those lovely training courses that you've done this year with us and last year, I'm really feeling that one of the benefits for me that comes out of reflective practice is slowing down
Yeah,
because there is no doing. My brain can kind of drop and my body drop and my nervous system because I'm just opening to discovering or finding or not finding, for
yeah,
being, just drop into being and how that changes my doing. If I have more time for being, then when I come to doing, it's less frantic, it's less like, oh, I gotta do it. It can be slower, and something about the reflexivity, if that's the word, becomes integral to how I do in the future. So
yeah.
the doing and the being become more interlinked. I don't know if you found that in your own practice over the years, that the more you stop and reflect, the more reflection is just part of your day to day.
Absolutely. I think you're spot on. It does become a way of being.
Yeah.
So being a reflective practitioner, or maybe even like a reflective person,
Yeah.
that there is this, yeah, this different quality that is slower, that I think maybe a quality of ease, which I think for me in my work life is really helpful as a foundation when things are busy and there are stresses and decisions, to actually have a base to return to about, okay, I do know how to help myself here slow down and get into that reflective gear for a moment.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
Mm.
So we'll just complete now, and Alison will share a very short couple of questions just to help you as the listener to drop into this reflective place.
Okay, so we'll just do a very short practice, and you may like to have a pen and paper or something that you can jot down your thoughts as we go. Or you might just want to receive this and just sit with whatever comes up. So I invite you to just make yourself comfortable. Maybe sit back a little bit in your seat. Perhaps give your shoulders a little roll and just take a moment to notice where you're at. Might want to take a few slightly deeper breaths just to allow yourself to slow down and move into a slightly more reflective gear. So maybe we'll just take 3 deep breaths in and out together. So we'll breathe in and out, breathing in and out. And just one more. In and out. And then just an invitation to be curious, just to check in with yourself and ask yourself that question. How am I doing? How does my body feel when I slow down and give it some attention? How is my mind in this moment? Perhaps perhaps it's slow and calm. Maybe it's full and racing. We're not trying to judge it, we're just noticing. And then also turning our attention to our emotional sense. What emotions might be there when we tune in and slow down? And then as we have this moment with ourselves, just invite you to cast your mind back over the last few months. How has your life been? When you think of these past few months, or maybe weeks, whatever's right for you, what comes to mind when you think, how has my life been? You might want to jot down some words that come to your mind, or just sit with it. And then a further question. How has your work life been? What are the words or sensations that come to mind when you think about that? How has work been in my life over the last few months? How have I been feeling in relation to my work? What has kept you going over the last few months? What has sustained you? Perhaps given you a feeling of vitality or enthusiasm, or maybe if things have been tough, what's allowed you to keep going? Let's take a moment to notice what comes into your mind with that question. What has sustained me? And then lastly, as you pause, think about how you're doing, think about how work has been, notice what has helped you to keep going, to feel well. What do you think you might need more of in the weeks and months ahead to help you to be as well as possible, as balanced as possible, to keep your personal and your professional well-being in mind? What might you need more of? Maybe you're jotting down some thoughts, maybe you're just sitting with this. But I wonder if you would like to set an intention for yourself for the weeks and months ahead, just for how you might like to be, or something you might want to build in. Maybe you can jot that intention down, keep that with you as a bit of a guide in the weeks and months to come. And then when you're ready, just coming back to your normal way of being and, yeah, perhaps noticing how it was to tap into that reflective gear. Thank you.